So the damages we see along the coast range from damage to houses, roads, utilities. In this case, it's the road and some of the utilities that were damaged. And some of the way that we build, we've learned that there are better ways to build that can avoid some of that damage. It's not just about avoiding damage to individual houses, but we also need to think about what we do on a single property and how that might affect other properties. And so some of these damages might be avoidable if development is done differently or sited differently. So land subject to coastal storm flowage has a lot of different functions. One of those is to slow down floodwaters and allow them to naturally dissipate as they move across the landform surface, provide some frictional resistance, thereby dissipating the energy and the destruction potential. So as the waves move up onto this granular beach here, the beach moves and shifts and dissipates that energy. So that natural function of the beach with that gently sloping, with the natural sand, gravel and cobble in this particular beach, it's a mix of different sediments. Those move and shift to dissipate that energy. And sometimes that what you see as energy dissipation is also erosion, because the beach's natural mechanism is to move some of the sediment or erode it into the near shore, create a bar, and that bar then trips the waves before they get to the beach. But the ability of those beaches to erode and move and shift is part of that energy dissipation. So when floodwaters encounter any kind of obstruction, you can get redirection or channelization of floodwaters, particularly moving floodwater and waves around objects. And so it's important to understand what the flood conditions are at the site so that you can avoid that redirection or channelization onto others. So allowing the floodwater to go under, in this case, this is a velocity zone, and this would have waves coming across this dune. Allowing those to go under the house and spread over a wider area makes a big difference in slowing down the floodwaters rather than redirecting it around this house onto the adjacent properties. And so elevating houses in areas that have wave energy or moving water is important to consider. So you need to look at avoiding deflection, reflection, and redirection of floodwaters that could channelize and have more water flowing at higher velocities onto adjacent resource areas, properties, affect roads and public infrastructure. So elevating that lowest structural member above the base flood elevation and taking into account sea level rise for the life of the building is recommended. That's in terms of what's required right now. As you know, there are requirements under the building code for protection of the building, and there are requirements under the Wetlands Act for protecting dunes. Since this is a dune, you want to be protecting both of those. But when we have a resource area that's just land subject to coastal storm flowage, it's still important to take a look at what the conditions are and what might be necessary for that site. So this is another example where we have a more gravelly, cobbly beach, and that dissipates the energy as the waves rush up onto it, reduces the energy and destruction potential of landward areas. You can see the telephone poles here. There's utilities that can be affected. So energy dissipation is important for protection of all of those interests. And then as water spreads landward, it can deposit sediment as part of the energy dissipation as well. In this case, it's an overwash deposit. There is a road that runs through here, and all of the sediment was deposited on the road as part of the energy dissipation. It not only shifts some into the near shore, but it also deposits sediment landward. That's all energy dissipation and all natural beneficial function. I'm sure the DPW doesn't think it's natural and beneficial when they have to clear the road, but trying to find ways to work with that system is what we work with communities on, to find some better options to work with the system. Floodwaters can also be detained or absorbed into the ground just by having regular pervious surface. If they can permeate into the ground, that's an important function. So having natural vegetation and the natural surface as much as possible does help with that permeable nature of the floodplain so that it can do that energy dissipation. So development in the floodplain should think about trying to allow as much of that pervious cover as possible for flood absorption. There are situations where we have a lot of development that's occurred and there are storm damages that can happen. In this case, the town of Hull asked for some assistance. Whoops, get back there. Town of Hull asked for assistance because this roadway is one of their evacuation routes, and Atlantic Ave was getting damaged every winter. It was getting pavement ripped up. There's an existing seawall on the front side of this barrier beach, but there's so much water coming over it. There was a tremendous amount of flow over the barrier, and water was getting channelized around these solid foundations, creating a lot of scour that was ripping up not only driveways, causing damage to homes, and ripping up Atlantic Ave. So in order for them to mitigate this situation, they actively sought FEMA grants to help elevate these homes, reduce some of the impervious surfaces, and restore floodplain function. And, you know, looking at some of the lessons learned from these development practices is important for all of us, because that's consistent with some of what you've seen from FEMA in other parts of the country as well from storms. So the amount of overwash that they were getting had a tremendous amount of velocity associated with it, was creating a lot of erosion. So buildings on solid foundations in that situation where there's that much flow and water movement can channelize flow and cause higher velocities that can cause damage to others. So increasing the vegetation and reducing impervious areas helps absorb the flow, slow down the floodwaters so that they can reduce the damage to other properties. Some of the things that do obstruct flow and cause reflection of it or deflection of it to channelize flow are solid fencing. Any kind of solid fencing like this is going to channelize the flow. Solid retaining walls, even breakaway walls below the base flood elevation. If you have a lot of moving water going through there, this is only designed to break away in the higher level storm event. In the smaller ones, it reflects it around or channelizes it. And so this is a construction practice that's not typically allowed under the building code now for this, for the velocity zone or flood zone. This other retaining walls can also deflect flow around them. So not only have we seen those same patterns here in Massachusetts in storms, but also in Hurricane Sandy, FEMA sends out building engineers after each of the major disasters and does an analysis of why buildings failed. And there are very detailed mitigation assessment team reports, is what they're called, that are posted on FEMA's website that have a lot of good information about why things, what worked, what didn't, what needs to change, and helps inform some of our building codes and helps us understand landform function. So this is one of those situations where they had some channelization of flow that developed a series of flow channels that caused damage to houses on the back side of the barrier beach. So this is the ocean side over on the right and the bay side over on the left. This is flow channel A. And what happened in flow channel A is this house got washed back into the bay because it got completely undermined and washed out. So that flow channel was had some of the strongest flows, but they also had flow channels B and C here on either side of this house that undermined that foundation and caused a collapse of that. And then in flow channel D, there was also house collapse of that foundation on one side that structurally compromised it. So it's important to consider the flow channelization issue that can cause damage to others and make sure that we're designing in a way that can avoid that. So project proponents and reviewers should, look at the regulations establish the authority for land subject to coastal storm flowage as a protected resource area. You need to presume that it is significant to storm damage prevention and flood control, and assess how it functions at the project site. So look at the flood zones, and we're going to walk through a couple examples of that, but you need to look at the functions and whether it has waves or moving water, what the functions are, and consider whether a potential project would adversely affect those functions and interests, and look at alternatives to at least minimize, if not avoid, those impacts so that we don't cause other damage. So going back to that flood map, there's a lot of information that you can get on the National Flood Hazard Layer that provides information about the different flood zones, the proximity of the site to various zones. And if you wanted to verify things like the fact that this line is right on top of that flood zone line, you can turn off various layers in the flood zone viewer so that you can see if something is obstructed by one layer, you can turn that off so you can check another. So some of the coastal barrier resource unit zones, for example, are these hash lines. Those can sometimes obstruct other information. Those are all things that you can easily turn on or off to view different pieces of information in the flood hazard map viewer. So for this first example, what I've done is taken a lot of different pieces of information and condensed them onto this slide. And these are all the things that you should be looking at for a proposed site or project. So this is a very densely developed area. And the one green spot that's left is where the project is proposed. So the velocity zone elevation 16 is out here. The A zone elevation 12, or the MIWA, is here. Your limit of moderate wave action is right along the existing revetment at the shoreline. So there's no coastal A or moderate wave action area polygon in this location. So the map is showing you're going straight from a 3-foot breaking wave landward to this area. It's all existing mowed grass right now. And it's a relatively flat site. And so topography is a big piece of information that you need in order to look at and assess a site. And also the proximity to wave energy is also a really critical thing to look at. So we're going to look at this site in a transect shore perpendicular right here along this line. And what we did is create a graphic here that shows the base flood elevation tapering down. You have waves out here, 3-foot breaking wave. The V zone ends at this line. But as we talked about, you don't have, 3-foot breaking wave. The energy doesn't just stop at that line magically. You are going to have some waves and moving water that continue landward across the site, given the topography. So the revetment does break the waves to a point, but the moving water coming across the site, we know that that's 3 feet deep because the base flood elevation in the A zone is 12 feet and your ground elevation is 9 feet. So we got that information, this from the flood insurance rate map and this from the ground survey. And the analysis would be a little more complicated if it wasn't a flat site, but we're going to use a flat site as an initial example. And so if a house on a solid foundation was proposed here and you have that much energy moving landward with 3 feet of water, then I would expect you would see redirection of that flow around that house. And with the adjacent houses being that close together, I would expect you might have damage to those adjacent houses by having this new house proposed in that location. And that's, usually the neighbors do speak up and express concern about that when there's development in that close of proximity, and they've seen the kind of energy that happens in storms. So if we go back to an aerial view, if they were proposing a house here the best option to avoid that channelization of flow would be to elevate it on open pilings to allow the floodwater unobstructed under the house so that there wouldn't be channelization of flow. They also wanted a garage. The garage can go on pilings and they can have a graded ramp right up to the garage so that they're not deflecting water in that case. And they also wanted a driveway. Obviously, they need to access the house. And this is the end of the road here now. The original proposal included fill to extend this roadway and create a driveway. The fill would have channelized water as well. And so the recommendation would be to avoid filling and to make the driveway a pervious material, minimize the footprint, and so that they're not doing anything that's going to redirect the flow. So there's a lot of different things that can be done, but it does depend on what your proximity is to that energy and that environment and what the topography is. So the second example I'm going to show you is a very different situation in terms, and the main difference is the topography. So in this case, we have a velocity zone out here. We've got the limit of moderate wave action here and the AE zone or MIWA back here. So it's also a situation where there's no coastal A or moderate wave action polygon. You've got a V and an A zone, but what's very, very different here is the topography. And so when you're doing a detailed analysis, you would pull up a topographic map and look at that detail. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of that. You can kind of see that the flood zone extent only goes up that far, and that's because the topography is rising. You've got going uphill here, you're going uphill in this direction, and this direction. So all of these adjacent homes are uphill of the proposed house site. And the floodwaters are slowing down as you go uphill. So this project is, again, a proposed house on a solid foundation, garage on a slab, paved driveway, and fill to level the site. So if we look at it in cross section as a transect, you can see a little bit more of the topography. And your wave energy, your V zone is coming in here to the LMWA. Your 3-foot breaking wave ends there. But then as you notice that because the topography is rising, the flood zone is tapering off rapidly in elevation because of that, the granular surface, but also the flood zone elevations are much lower on this site. And the landward areas are much higher in elevation. And so a proposed house in this location would not redirect flow onto an adjacent house or infrastructure. There would be some minor redirection of flow around it, but you don't have the depth of water, and you don't have the proximity of houses on either side of it. And so the recommendations would be to think about shifting the house as far landward in the A zone as they can, so that they're as far away from that energy as possible, and try to minimize the fill so that they're minimizing any redirection of flow, and make the driveway pervious. Those would be recommendations, but they're not going to be affecting in these adjacent houses as part of that project. So those are two examples to show you kind of the extremes. You are basically looking at topography, trying to do that analysis, and looking at the flood zones and the proximity to energy. That's the quick list of what you should do. So presume that the land subject to coastal storm flowage functions for storm damage prevention and flood control. Assess how it functions at the project site specific to the mapped flood zones. Consider what the impacts might be in design to try to protect the public interests. The answer that you put on, or that we see on a project application, should not be land subject to coastal storm flowage has no performance standards and therefore we don't need to deal with it. That's not the answer. This is the analysis that needs to be done to at least look at what the impacts are and consider the options. So protecting landform function is separate from what's protected by the building code, which is designed for building integrity. So a couple other things to keep in mind, that 30% of the NFIP claims do occur outside the map flood zones. And so considering sea level rise and coastal erosion as part of citing something along the coast is important. The flood maps capture the projected flood zones at the time the flood study is done. So that doesn't take into account future erosion or sea level rise. So trying to make sure that's part of your planning is strongly recommended. We do have some guidance that CZM and DEP have published that has a lot of this information about land subject to coastal storm flowage. These are the page numbers for where to find those sections in the coastal manual. We also have, there are sea level rise projections downscaled for Massachusetts on Resilient Mass. It used to be .org. It's now, you can either type in or .org and it'll redirect you, or go straight to the state website. We have a coastal erosion viewer that gives you information about shoreline change. And then you can also look at things like the mitigation assessment team report for Hurricane Sandy and read more about, a storm that could affect us as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa for an update on the status of the draft land subject to coastal storm flowage performance standards.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for all the great work that you do and the important work. I'm Lisa Rhodes. I'm the Mass DEP Wetlands Program Chief, and Rebecca asked me to come today to talk about our proposed regulations or update to the Wetlands Protection Act regulations and where they stand. You may or may not know that Mass DEP has been working for a number of years on this update to our regulations, very important update, which includes two primary components. The main one I'm going to talk about is land subject to coastal storm flowage. Land subject to coastal storm flowage is a resource area already protected in the Wetlands Protection Act regulations, but it is not, it has no performance standards and never has. And so we have been on a mission for many years now to get to develop standards and implement them in the regulations. And so we have a proposal. It's very thoughtful proposal. It involved a lot of people over a number of years, and we are planning to implement that in the upcoming year. The other part of the proposed regulations that's important is an update to the precipitation data that is used for stormwater design, particularly for peak rate attenuation, and also for floodplain, inland floodplain delineation in the event of a conflict. So we're proposing to discontinue use of the technical paper 40 developed by the National Weather Service in 1960. I believe it's 60 years old, and adopt the NOAA 14 atlas that was first published in 2015. We're proposing to adopt the upper level of the confidence interval of the NOAA 14 atlas. So those are two things that will be in our proposed regulation package. We are just awaiting final approval to publish those regulations, and so we expect that they will be published by the end of the year. If that occurs, we would expect to have probably a public information session or two, and then a couple of public hearings, probably in January. And then the comment period would be extended beyond what, you know, the normal 30 days to be at least 45-day comment period. So that would go into probably at least the end of January, you know, at least, depending on when we publish. Once those are published, we would, you know, then review the comments and see if any further revisions need to be made before final promulgation sometime in 2023. If you would like, and if we have time, I can just run through quickly the proposed standards for LSCSF. Depends on, I don't know how much time I have, Joy, so you can let me know. Or I can stop there.
Yeah, no, it's 12:36. So if it takes you about 5 or 10 minutes, that would be fine. And then Rebecca can answer, both of you could answer questions after that. Does that sound all right?
Oh,
Is that
yeah,
enough time?
I think it'll be less than 5 minutes because I would just,
Okay.
I'd just give you a very quick overview.
Yeah, I'm sure people would like to hear it. Thanks.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Oops.
Do you have screen sharing?
Oh, yeah, okay. Can everybody see that?
We can see your whole PDF
Okay,
program.
so let me try to get into the
Maybe at the bottom, that little projector symbol at the bottom. Oh, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but the main thing is, you know, as Rebecca mentioned to you all earlier, this layout will become very familiar because our proposed standards are sort of distinguished by whether you're in the velocity zone, the MOA zone, or the MEWA zone, which the MOA and the MEWA are the A zone, you know, distinguished by the LIMWA. So if you're listening to Rebecca, these are all available on the FEMA maps, and you do not need to know the heights of the waves coming into your site. So so you would find these on the FEMA maps. So if your project is in a V zone or a moderate wave action zone, which are the two, you know, most seaward zones on that cross section, you would, and this is for new development. I'm only talking about new development now, not redevelopment. For new development, buildings would need to be on open piles above the base flood elevation with 2-foot freeboard in the MOA zone. We are proposing no new buildings, even on piles, in the velocity zone for new development. There are certain activities that would be allowed in these zones, such as plantings, walkways, certain water dependent uses like boat launching facilities and open boat storage docks and piers, etc. In the MEWA zone, which is the landward part of the A zone, the standard would be elevation on piles or solid foundations with 1 foot of freeboard. Fill or structures should be avoided that would redirect flow or increase flooding, which is what Rebecca was just talking about with those examples. Soils and vegetations are recommended to be preserved, pavement limited, things like that. If you are impacting an area that is up gradient of a restriction, there would need to be avoidance or mitigation similar to the inland floodplain, you know, because these are areas where the coastal waters can't freely flow back to the ocean. So these are the standards for new development. For redevelopment, the standard is that you need to improve existing conditions And examples would be like Rebecca gave a lot of great ones today to reduce pavement or remove restrictions, things that would channelize flow, for example. If you're in the velocity zone, no expansion is allowed, but you can reconstruct structures on pilings, on open pilings. And in certain areas, elevation may be required, like new foundations in any zone for redevelopment. There are certain other, exceptions in the redevelopment standards, like for areas that are highly developed, like, what we were envisioning in that when we developed these regs was sort of city or town centers that are right on, the coastal zone. And in the MIWA zone, fill for flood control would be allowed. In the V zone or the MOA zone, elevation of existing seawalls or construction of berms for flood control purposes would be allowed as part of a flood control program that would be implemented by the entity who is responsible for, the seawall or the infrastructure, and no redirection of wave energy or floodwaters onto other properties. And that's an important standard that is, provided throughout the regulations. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on, there's a couple of other proposals. One is to allow roadway elevation because of the risk that, many roadways have today and access in and out of the coastal zone. So the proposal is that, elevation of roadways would be allowed, provided that the existing paved surface is not widened. But there may need to be adjustments at the toe of the slope in order to conduct that elevation. And this would be subject to certain protective standards, like minimal salt marsh alteration, and hydraulics and hydrology would need to be maintained. Roadway relocation would be, there's a provision for that, which requires an alternative analysis, requiring at least one of the alternatives be looking at an alternative route and not worsening existing flooding or erosion. Water dependent uses are also in that provision. We are promoting the use of nature-based solutions, and that may in some cases involve converting one resource area to another, but instead of hardened structures, which are not allowed. And then there's a provision for scientific test projects. So that's pretty much my summary, Joy. And then, Rebecca and I can now, stop and take questions.
Thanks so much. So Rebecca, you can see what's in the chat. I don't know if you need any guidance from me or not to do
Sure,
that.
we can start at the top. So land subject to coastal storm flowage is a Massachusetts term. It's in the Wetlands Protection Act statute. So as some of us might like to change it, it's in the statute. It is what it is. So, and then there was another question here about whether flow would destroy the permeable driveway if they put in gravel or paver, sorry, not paver, gravel, pea stone, that most of the wave energy is broken seaward of that. You are going to have some moving water, but I wouldn't expect a lot of damage to that. It is less likely to get damaged than I would think a paved driveway would be in that location. Next question was about mechanisms for enforcing LSCSF requirements. Right now, LSCSF is a protected resource area under the Wetlands Act. So if anybody is proposing to do work in it, they need to file with the Conservation Commission, just like they would with any other resource area. So it's up to the commission and DEP to decide what the conditions would be for a project in land subject to coastal storm flowage. the challenge is that we don't have a standard that says avoid or minimize. But right now, it is still something that people need to look at as part of a project. And then there's a question about, you're assuming that considering future sea level rise, the current 0.2% floodplain is not considered LSCSF. As defined, I had the definition up there. It's the 1% chance storm, surge of record, or storm of record. So if there is surge that's gone beyond the 1% chance mapped floodplain, and that's been documented, that can be considered as part of LSCSF by definition. Let's see, the next one here was about whether this only applies to coastal flood zones. And velocity zones, as I said in the chat, are typically only along the coast. And the moderate wave action area is going to be directly along the coast. But the minimal wave action area can be along the coast, and you can also have that landward of and from a riverine source. And so it's hard to, there isn't a real line on the maps that says coastal versus riverine in terms of your flood zones. It doesn't differentiate those. Let's see, what else did I miss?
Rebecca, I had asked a question about the, because the regs that Lisa just showed clearly state 2 foot in the V zone. I just wondered how that might conflict with the 10th edition of the building code, and whether or not it could be readdressed so that there is no conflict with the building code, and whichever is the more restrictive would apply. Have they thought about that?
My understanding is that the updated building code is looking at adopting that same standard, which would include a 2 foot freeboard in the MOA.
So there is an updated version of the building code, Lisa, that is now proposing 3 feet of freeboard in V and coastal A, and 2 feet in A. That is draft and would be going out for public comment. I think what we've discussed in the past is if that's passed in the building code, DEP would look at possibly incorporating that, as part of your public process as well. But either way, the more restrictive of the two would be the requirement you need to meet.
Yes, and that would be a great comment to make, during the public comment period.
Absolutely. Anybody else have questions that aren't in the chat? Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions. I showed a couple examples to give you a feel for the difference between 2 different scenarios, but there's a lot of other scenarios of different conditions and fill being proposed and other things that weren't covered.
Rebecca, do you know of any upcoming training on the coastal manual? I know you had given quite a bit of it when you updated that coastal manual a few years ago, but is that something that CZM presents on a regular basis?
So CZM and DEP have, we've proposed a workshop at the spring MACC conference on the coastal manual, focusing on the developed or altered resource area delineations. That's causing a lot of challenges for conservation commissions and consultants, where you have altered developed dunes, banks, barrier beaches, beaches. So that is being proposed for MACC in the spring, and the Association of Mounts Wetland Scientists is also asked to offer that same workshop for their members. So that will be coming up soon. And I also will be working with DEP on additional training on LSCSF. As those standards move forward, we'll be working on additional outreach and training.
Thank you.
Yes, we plan a robust training series of trainings once the new regulations are implemented.
Thank you. Are you going to thank the speakers, Noah?
I was
don't wanna-
going to point out that there was another question from Mike Enko in the chat. If a homeowner is seeking to elevate or have their home acquired within the LCSF, it doesn't sound like the new regulations will restrict their ability to do so. Question mark?
Prevent them from elevating or
Having it
what's-
acquired by FEMA
Um,
or just being acquired in general to be bought out?
either or.
Yeah, Mike, do you
Michael, if
want
you
to
wanna-
unmute yourself?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking for more from a FEMA perspective. But I guess, you know, if you want to answer to either, if there's other means.
The proposed standards, you know, would require a certain amount of elevation, not depending on which zone you're in. So that would be encouraged. You know, if you're looking to sell your home, no, the proposed standards wouldn't have any effect on that. If
No,
that's
we
what
would
you're
certainly
asking.
encourage people to have their homes acquired if they're in very vulnerable areas and pursue those FEMA acquisition programs.
Right.
Great, thank you.
And then there's another question here. Will additional clarity regarding the DEP policy 92-1 be provided with the updated regulations?
Yes, 92.1, I'll have to look back, but
Coastal Bank,
yes. Excuse me?
Coastal Bank delineation is
Yes, we'll have
92-1.
to, you know, we'll have to evaluate the policies that we have to see if there's anything that needs updating as a result, sure.
Okay, so just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you for being members of massFM. Please do your best to encourage other people to be members of massFM. There may be a point in the future where only members can come to this, and there may be a point in the future where people who are not members could pay to come to this lunch and learn, but we always try to have a program that's of value to you. So I just want to thank you for being here today and turn this over to Noah.
I just wanted to encourage everyone who's still here. We have 7 minutes left to this lunch and learn. The lunch and learn is intended to be a little bit more casual than other webinars and so on. So please feel free to unmute yourselves, show us your faces, say hello. If anybody has anything else that they want to announce, if there's a big statewide climate assessment that is looking for feedback that anybody wants to talk about, this is a great opportunity for that sort of thing. For a few minutes before everybody has to go back to whatever else you were working on before this.
Yes, the statewide climate assessment, I sent out a message across the Commonwealth last week, I think, to encourage people to take a look at the statewide climate assessment, the Massachusetts climate change assessment. It's new and it's open for everyone to look at and comment on online. I think if you go to mass.gov and type in climate change assessment, you'll probably find it. Otherwise, you can email me and I'll send you a link to it. And my email is joy.duperalt@mass.gov. Thanks. Thanks for bringing that up, Noah.
Lisa, there's a question in the chat about whether there'll be a definition of expansion in the new standards.
I'm trying to remember if we actually, I don't think we actually defined expansion, but I think that we do indicate or say that it's like the footprint of the structure. So going, you know, larger than the footprint of the structure. So I think there is some language in there that clarifies that. But if not, you know, I believe that there is, so that would be a good comment. And this is a good opportunity to, you know, tell you all that we encourage you to comment, you know, if you think that these regulations are a positive step forward for the Commonwealth and you support them, you know, we encourage you to comment, you know, during the comment period and say so. I think that we all know, you know, that there's been an increase in flooding and concern about flood issues. And so I think these steps are a really positive step forward for protection of of our resources and to improve resiliency for the state.
Anybody else have something to share?